CWM's DARE evolved on three platforms. There are the DARE resources for church use in the forms of Bible studies and handbooks that explain topics in relation to the focus and themes of CWM. For instance, doing theology and reading the Bible in the context of empires.
Second, there are the DARE forums, which bring together theologians, biblical scholars, and activists to share their wisdom and present papers on various topics, again in relation to the themes and focus of CWM, but with openness to insights in the fields of theological and religious studies. The presenters include men and women, older and younger folk, church and non-church folk, scholars and students from the Global South and the Global North.
And not least, we have the DARE publications. Several, but not all of the papers from the DARE forums are revised and published so that they are available as resources for theological education.
COVID-19 has infected us with another platform, an online one. We cannot hold the 2020 DARE Forum as planned, so we are introducing eDARE for 2020. eDARE will be webinars with presentations by people from different parts of the world, from China, India, South Korea, Africa, Switzerland, UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Jamaica, USA, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, and Fiji.
There will also be poets to help us reflect on the presentations, as well as a panel on the final session of the webinars to engage the artworks of two Filipino artists. Poets and artists have ways of thinking that can help church and academic folk think, function, and step out of our comfort zones into spaces full of surprises and excitement. So, welcome to this platform and this event of eDARE.
Aman, selamat malam, ya Rana, and good evening to those of us in Asia and Pasifika. Good morning and good afternoon to you who are Zooming and Facebooking from other parts of the world. This webinar is being recorded and broadcast live on Zoom and Facebook. For participants on Zoom, we now post two poll questions on your screen for you to please answer, and the results will be shared later on the chat. This is the second of three eDARE webinars for the Asia and Pacifica regions, in which we reflect on the challenges and opportunities of COVID-19. The eDARE webinars aim to help us reflect on how we might navigate our unprepared, unhealthy, and uncaring societies, including our churches, in this context of COVID-19. This evening, three people will help us think of intersections between COVID-19 and HIV/AIDS, and how may we function as interpreters of scripture, interpreters of church teachings, interpreters of art, and interpreters of culture. One of the intentions of this eDARE webinars is to encourage those of us in Asia and Pacifica to hear the voices from other parts of the world, and other parts of the world to hear the voices from Asia and Pacifica. So tonight we have voices from Africa and Europe that we in Asia and Pacifica need to hear. The first presentation is going to be by Beverly Haddad, who is professor and senior researcher with the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Our second presenter will be Volker Kuster, who is professor of comparative religion and missiology, the Faculty of Protestant Theology, Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz, Germany. And Haji Saji, who is currently with the faculty at the School of Global Studies, Foundation Academy of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. So first, a warm welcome to our presenters. I also welcome and invite Julie Sim, the CWM Missional Secretary for Asia, to offer a welcome and message on behalf of CWM. Julie?
Thank you, Sione. Sisters and brothers, church leaders, ecumenical partners, colleagues in ministry, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Council for World Mission eDARE webinar. I'm Julie Sim, the Mission Secretary for Council for World Mission, and on behalf of CWM Board of Directors, Secretariat, and the 32 member churches, I bring you greetings. We are privileged to be your host today. We thank you for your participation at this global meeting that is attended by friends, colleagues from different parts of the world. Thank you for taking time out and being here with us today. COVID-19 pandemic has put the world in a holding period with several, I call, new abnormal. It is not normal to walk around wearing a mask. It is not normal to keep a 1 meter social distancing with one another. It is not normal to continue working and live in a virtual reality. We do not see this new normal in 2020 BC, before COVID. Because of COVID, the internet is gaining more importance than ever before. The world has become more screen-driven, and we see greater participation through our digital presence, like one today. But friends, not everyone has access to the internet. So this pandemic is a great revealer. It reveals one more dangerous weakness of our society, the digital divide. And depending on which side you sit on the divide, the hyper-connected world or the world of a digital outcast. And this digital divide is not only a technical or technological gap. It is a thank you for being here with us through your digital presence. We could not have done this eDARE webinar without your support. We will hear and learn from one another through your presentations in a while, your valuable insights, your wisdom, your contributions toward promoting life flourishing communities in this age of COVID-19 pandemic. Let me take this opportunity to congratulate you, panelists, for your work. And we really look forward engaging with you in a while. So with this, let me hand over the time to our moderator today, my colleague, Sione. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. As we try to manage our situation in the BC that you have named. There will be two stages of our webinar this evening. There'll be first, three presentations will be offered by our colleagues, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers in the remainder of our time. And for those of you on Zoom, you can place your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. The first presenter is Beverly Haddad, and the title of her presentation is private and public pandemics in South Africa, theological imperatives summoned by HIV and COVID-19. So, Bev, please.
Thank you. Health crises affect communities to varying degrees across the world, but usually have a greater impact on poorer nations. But COVID-19 has changed that. The pandemic has spread across the globe at an alarming rate, affecting all geographic locations and communities, and has in some ways had a greater impact on the richest nations of the world. I live in the epicenter of the HIV pandemic, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And I will draw on my activist, academic, and ministry experience of HIV to engage the new theological challenges of COVID. Before embarking on this theological reflection, I want to briefly compare the public health response of the South African government to the two pandemics of HIV and COVID. The first two cases of HIV in South Africa, documented in 1983, involved gay men, and it was soon labeled a gay disease. However, this perception changed dramatically as HIV transmission extended to the heterosexual community. And now, almost 40 years later, 7.5 million South Africans are HIV positive, with an estimated death rate of over 330,000. Despite HIV quickly becoming a serious public health issue, the South African Health Department followed the human rights approach taken in the USA. HIV was treated differently from other sexually transmitted and lethal infectious diseases, resulting in what can be called HIV exceptionalism. This exceptionalist approach has contributed to a conspiracy of silence, fueling stigma and discrimination against those who are HIV positive. HIV became a private pandemic. The public health response to the COVID pandemic has been vastly different. Within 3 weeks of the first case of COVID-19 being identified, the country was placed into one of the hardest lockdowns in the world, and a public health emergency was declared. The COVID pandemic is public in every way, and churches have had to embrace the public health protocols, encouraging members to abide by the regulations, shut their doors, and embrace digital forms of being church until very recently. This is a far cry from the response by churches to the HIV pandemic, where religious leaders were key players in promoting stigma and thwarting public health messages. In each of these pandemics, theologians have scrambled to respond to the ethical challenges that have emerged. And so I want to briefly sketch 3 theological imperatives that emerge out of both of these pandemics. The first is a Christological, what I call Christological imperative. If you look at this piece of artwork, it's a painting by Maxwell Lawton, an American. It was created in 1993 as a reflection of his own experience of having AIDS and the meaning for him of Christ amidst his own suffering. Here Christ has lesions indicating AIDS. He's naked, despairing, and wearing the crown of thorns, all of which amplify his suffering. The words of Matthew 25, "When you offer care to the least of these, my brethren, you are doing it to me," are etched into the background and express Lawton's desire for the acceptance he experiences in his Christ as a person who is HIV positive. The next image. Can we have the next image, please? Let me continue. Perhaps it will come up onto the screen. The next image is not very well known. There it is. In fact, the artist is unknown. It appeared on social media and went viral during Easter this year. And here we see the contemporary Christ, who offers us a picture that is very familiar to us, complete with ventilator, oxygen mask, and drips. The bystanders are medical staff dressed in personal protective equipment, one with their hands on their head, suggesting that the patient, Jesus, is dying. The power of this artistic representation, set in the contemporary context of the COVID pandemic, is how it evokes our immediate identification with the Christ who suffers, the one who understands, and vicariously takes on the anxiety of those of us who fear death caused by the virus. While there was an outrage on social media in both cases at these so-called heretical portrayals of Christ, I want to argue that these artistic portrayals stand over against a dominant theology of retribution, and they offer us a different view of God. Retribution theology coalesces with cultural notions of illness in our context, where illness is a sign that you have displeased the ancestors and are ill because you have done something wrong. Theologies of retribution have resulted in stigma and discrimination during the HIV pandemic, and no doubt now in the COVID pandemic. Just as prophetic theological challenges have had to break through the silent public stigmatizing discourse of HIV, so too do we need this in the COVID pandemic. The second theological imperative that I want to address is what I've called ecclesiological. As indicated earlier, because of the overt public health discourse and government regulations curtailing public worship, church leaders had to scramble to find other ways of being church, mostly digitally. But can our churches use this opportunity to reject destructive church theology and find new life-giving approaches to being church? This has not been the case during the critical moments of the HIV pandemic. While I've yet to conduct sustained research, I have been noting approaches taken by the various church leaders in my own Anglican denomination to the COVID pandemic. I have tracked the weekly sermons and pastoral approaches in two congregations known to me. The first is a relatively affluent middle-class congregation that makes weekly services, including sermons, available on YouTube, as well as daily reflections on WhatsApp. Seldom, if ever, do these evangelical church leaders make direct reference to the COVID pandemic. Monthly news bulletins sent by email have addressed the issue only as it pertains to government regulations on the closure and opening of churches or financial matters. But no mention is made of people in the congregation who are ill with COVID, and there has been little engagement with the enormous social and economic challenges facing surrounding communities due to the national lockdown. Instead, the focus is on traditional evangelical biblical exegesis, with few attempts to apply the insights contextually. The second is a working class congregation led by a rector who stands in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. Here too, weekly services, including sermons, are available on YouTube and WhatsApp. Sermons during the height of the pandemic have always been contextual, often beginning with a direct reference to the context and then applying biblical exegesis directly to the meaning of faith in these troubled times. In addition, the rector of the congregation has produced a separate weekly notice bulletin on YouTube, in which the ongoing pastoral and outreach life of the congregation is addressed. Those who are COVID positive are named, including details of isolation at home and hospitalization and deaths. This included his own isolation at home when he was displaying COVID symptoms. There's also been overt engagement with the physical needs of those in the community as a result of lockdown. In all these ways, the rector has been true to his Anglo-Catholic theological roots and embraced an embodiment of the COVID realities in the life of the church. This has opened space for reflection, prayer, and activist engagement by members of the congregation. There can be no doubt that COVID stigma has been limited by the integration and embracing of the public discourse, enabling new ways of being church to emerge. The third theological imperative is missiological. How we view our work in the world as people of faith depends substantially on the way we do theology. Traditional theology places emphasis on personal moral sin. This was literally deadly in the context of the HIV pandemic, where individuals were blamed for their HIV positive status without any recognition of the structural dimensions of the pandemic. Yet issues of gender, race, sexual orientation, and class rendered some more vulnerable to HIV than others. Emphasizing individual morality further marginalized particular groups of people, leading to greater HIV risk and a conspiracy of silence that led to death. Addressing these structural dimensions was critical to curbing the pandemic, and our theological analysis of the public health issue had to critically engage and intersect insights offered by the social sciences. It was this intersection that enabled liberatory forms of engaged and contextual theological reflection, which offered life and hope amidst a great deal of death. The COVID pandemic is no different. Issues of gender, race, sexual orientation, and class do have an influence on the vulnerability to COVID infection. Gender-based violence has escalated globally during national lockdowns. The economic downturn in the global economy continues to wreak the havoc of unemployment, destitution, and vulnerability to exploitation. There has been repression of sexual minorities during lockdowns, and studies are beginning to demonstrate the structural dimensions of vulnerability in racial and ethnic minorities. This all points to a future research agenda for theological reflection. However, what is different in the COVID pandemic is that it is a global phenomenon resulting in a global effort to mitigate the pandemic and ultimately find a vaccine. This provides a unique opportunity for theologies of solidarity to emerge that embrace the structural dimensions of the pandemic, offering liberatory and prophetic forms of public theologies. And so as I conclude, I want to suggest that the COVID pandemic offers the opportunity for activist intellectuals to infiltrate the corridors of traditional church theology and provide creative ways of understanding the nature of God, of becoming a church stripped of patriarchal and institutional power, and of moving forward in acts of solidarity that bring hope and life amidst the threat of darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly. You've started us on with a very powerful call on how to be creative in this particular context. So I will move right on to our next presenter. Volker Kuster's presentation is titled Interpretation Against What If Not Punishment. Volker, please.
Hello to everyone. In my school days, Albert Camus' The Plague was a popular text in religious education classes to explain what theodicy, the question why does God allow such suffering, is all about. When the COVID-19 pandemic gained momentum, Camus' book had a renaissance and was sold out in Germany as well as in France and Italy. It took weeks before publishers came up with new editions to meet the demand. Camus gives a dense description how the plague affects the Algerian coastal city Oran. Among the often ambiguous characters, especially the medical doctor Bernard Rieu and the Jesuit priest Panelou have drawn the attention of theologically informed readers. Two key scenes in particular. The first is a sermon by Panelou in a mass dedicated to Saint Rochus, the saint of the plague, at the end of a prayer week organized by the church authorities in response to the epidemic. Panelou starts with the exclamation, "Calamity has come on you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserve it." What follows is a classical penitential sermon. The second scene is staged as the deathbed of a child. A grotesque parody of crucifixion, where Rieu and Panelou meet. Rieu snaps at Panelou, "Ah, that child anyhow was innocent, and you know it as well as I do." Panelou confronts Rieu afterwards. Their positions seem irreconcilable. While Rieu is ready to fight illness, death, and evil even in the absence of hope, facing the absurdity of creation, Panelou is full of hope in God's grace amidst all hopelessness. Panelou is concerned about salvation, Rieu about healing and saving lives. Yet Rieu tells the priest, "What I hate is death and disease, as you well know. And whether you wish it or not, we are allies, facing them and fighting them together. God himself can't part us now." People also turn to Hollywood for guidance. Steven Soderbergh's 2011 thriller Contagion was sold out in electronic stores and traded at high prices on the internet. Soderbergh, who is an independent filmmaker gone Hollywood, did not direct one of the usual catastrophes, devastation, mass panic, and personalized suffering movies of the disaster genre, but concentrated on how national and international health institutions and their doctors try to manage a pandemic. His crew did extensive research on the earlier SARS pandemic in 2002-03 and had scientific advisors present throughout the shooting of the film. The film starts with cool distant scenes showing how infected people around the globe touch surfaces and leave their viral fingerprints before eventually breaking down. The captivating electronic soundtrack draws the viewer into the dynamic of the movie. Different from Camus' story, religion does not play a role for the plot, neither as horizon of interpretation nor through its agents. The only reference occurs when a doctor informs Mitch Emhoff, Matt Damon, that his wife, who is patient 0, has died and he does not want to believe it but gets angry instead. The doctor refers him to a hospital chaplain, hardly mentioning the profession. "We have people to help you cope with this." Beth Emhoff has committed adultery with a former lover during her stopover in Chicago, who also gets infected and dies. The doctors who reconstruct the spread of the virus feel pity for Mitch Emhoff and hesitate to tell him. This classical case for Christian moralists invites to talk about God's punishment, but nothing is uttered in that direction. There is a conspiracy theorist, agents from the Department of Homeland Security who suspect terrorism, wicked brokers, and capitalists who want to speculate on the vaccine, who makes the scenario all that real. But the protagonists of the film are the doctors and their engagement to manage the crisis and find a cure. The central figure is Dr. Alice Cheever, Lawrence Fishburne, the head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. Throughout the film, one can see how he is trying to take care of his mainly female colleagues and the people he is responsible for. A key storyline to portray his character is the interaction with the cleaner. When he talks to his wife over the phone in his office, telling her to leave Chicago quietly, he all of a sudden realizes that the cleaner obviously has overheard the conversation. In leaving, the guy says, "We all have people." In an earlier scene, he has asked the doctor for advice regarding the illness of his son. Homeland Security accuses Cheever for treason because his wife told her friend who spread the news on the social media. The underlying conflict is that between the national security state and humanitarianism. At the end, Shiva appears at the home of the cleaner and ejects the son his ration of the vaccine, telling the cleaner he's safe now. Only then he drives home to vaccinate his wife. The end of the film shows how the virus came into the world and how Bet Emhoff got infected. A bat, chased up by a bulldozer of the mining company she is working for, drops a bite of banana over a pig stable. The cook who slaughtered the pig that ate it shakes afterwards Bet Emhoff's hand after just rubbing his hands in his apron. It is clear to the viewer that this can easily happen again. This resonates with the end of Camus' The Plague, when Dr. Rieu reasons about the fact that the virus never dies and is still out there to resurface at a given moment. While Camus deals with an epidemic, Soderbergh tackles a pandemic. Both consider viruses as part of nature, and their protagonists try to save as much of their fellow human beings as they can. While Camus addresses the absurdity of human life, Soderbergh keeps it strictly rational. The illness is neither metaphorized nor stigmatized in both cases. In a similar pragmatic way, Dr. Hendrik Streeck, co-author of the Heinsberg study, one of Germany's first corona hotspots, during the carnival season in North Rhine-Westphalia, argues that we will have to integrate COVID-19 into our virus repertoire and learn how to live with it. German sociologist Ulrich Beck introduced the concept of World Risk Society as a framework to understand globalization. Terrorism, pandemics, ecological disasters are all risks that go with it. Two things are striking. People are obviously no longer referring to the Bible and the Christian God, but rather to popular culture and a French philosopher of the absurd to interpret the pandemic. And they refer to the plague that has even been more or less extinguished from the planet, rather than to the late modern scourge, HIV/AIDS. Susan Sontag, a New York cultural critic, became famous for her paradoxical polemic against interpretation of illness and the HIV/AIDS pandemic. After being diagnosed with cancer, she decided to write a book that was not one of the usual "How I Defeated the Illness" stories, but a manifesto against prevalent interpretations and the triad of othering, metaphorization, and stigmatization of illness, with denial and demonizing as further sub-strategies. 10 years later, after the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS pandemic that affected many of her friends, she revisits her earlier book and writes against interpretation again. In both cases, the illness is often regarded as self-induced due to psychological weakness in the case of cancer, or sexual libertinism and perversion of HIV/AIDS infected. The latter is the illness of a sexually stigmatized group, homosexual men, and of addicts who are consuming intravenous drugs. The HIV/AIDS pandemic among heterosexuals in Africa, which represents more than 70% of the infected with the highest death toll, is neglected. Obviously, this stigmatization is so imprinted in our cultural memory that people rather refer to the plague in the current situation. Even though there would have been much to learn from the HIV/AIDS pandemic, in spite of all obvious differences between the diseases. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, the strategy of othering is widely applied as is that of mere denial. Trump speaks about the Chinese virus. In Africa, it is the illness of the whites. Yet everybody can catch it. It is not stigmatized. Celebrities and politicians publicly speak about their infection and the cause of the disease, nor metaphorized either. Church leaders were quick to announce that COVID-19 was not God's punishment. Even in American evangelical and fundamentalist circles, the argument was not popular, which leaves it to some Christian extremists and the IS. American evangelicals entertain conspiracy theories instead, at the same time a secular version of the punishment metaphor is deployed by climate change activists like Greta Thunberg. If the punishment metaphor for illness is rejected right away, even though the biblical texts seem to be more ambiguous here, then modern church leaders and theologically we should be aware that God is not at the disposal of human reasoning. The question remains, how do we respond theologically to the challenge that COVID-19 is posing to our societies and religious communities within them? Biblical texts like the Psalms, Job, but also the Gethsemane story and Christ's outcry on the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" point the direction to bringing one's grief before God, even doubting and questioning God. The vulnerability of human beings is mirrored in the presence of God in the suffering on the cross. While Jürgen Moltmann has interpreted this as a suffering within God, Johann Baptist Metz emphasizes that we also suffer from God. Evil, illness, aging, suffering, and death are part of God's creation too. This is the ambiguity in which we have to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. The new triad, social distance, sanitize, and wear your mask, does demand that religious communities adapt their ritual practices. It certainly does not mean that the care for those in need should be neglected out of misunderstood hygiene concepts. How do Metz plead for a TODC-sensitive God talk and his constant appeal to remember the victims resonate in the context of the corona pandemic? What is asked for is that churches humble themselves and stand in solidarity with the victims. We are in need of a liberation theology that analyzes the intersectionality of class, race, gender, body, age, etc. behind the pandemic and develops a habitus which allows to respond to the intergenerational, intercultural, and interreligious challenge in dealing with the pandemic. And at the same time, has the courage to raise its prophetic voice and point out that COVID-19 is not the only risk that is shaking our planet.
Thank you, Volker. We'll get straight into Haji's paper because he's taking us to one of the strands of the evangelical faith. Haji's title is Stripping the Thief in the Night, Decolonizing Pentecostal Eschatology as a Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic. Haji?
Thank you, sir. Let me start immediately. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen various responses by different groups and classes. One of the interesting responses is the Christian eschatology among conservative Christian groups. The idea of Christian eschatology has achieved prominence in the political, economic, socio-cultural, and ecological discourses over the past several decades, especially during the establishment of the modern state of Israel, the Y2K bug problem, the 9/11 attacks, and the threat of the climate change or global warming. The Christian eschatological thought continued to be a common responses to contemporary global issues. Most of these conservative Christian groups often approach and interpret the scripture using the global current events. In connection with this, the emergence of dispensationalism, particularly among conservative evangelicals and Pentecostals, indicate that the global Christianity has not quite outgrown this religious ideology, despite so many criticisms. In fact, this eschatological model does not supersede, but rather competes with other religious eschatological models. Many fundamentalist Christian preachers in the West and non-Western nations continue to quote the above eschatological model. To address this challenge, I divided this paper into two parts. First and foremost, I will attempt to address the question why dispensational theology receives so much criticism. Although it's openly discussed why this eschatological thought is considered to be a dangerous version of Christian eschatology. In order to sort out the hidden violence carried out by the teaching of dispensationalism, I explored the four implications of dispensationalism that gave rise to heated debate among Christian theologians. In the last part, I would like to address the question or use decoloniality to intervene in this relevant and crucial, to be a crucial approach to address today's Christian eschatological challenges. Let's, first of all, dispensational theology tends to spiritualize the gospel and emphasize the sharp separation between bodily and spiritual needs of the people. This is the tragic impact of Western Greek dualistic worldview that absorbed into Christian thought. According to Wright, it implied that the Christian message might be privately engaging but publicly irrelevant. However, this violence-stalking rhetoric is not new. It is an age-old tactic of Western European colonial rulers. Most Christian groups that embrace this future-oriented eschatology are indifferent toward social issues like global poverty, human rights issues, climate change, etc. etc. For example, due to the end-time Bible prophecy obsession, these doomsday preachers undermine the public health law and public health policy. In fact, most of these conservative Christian groups in denial over COVID-19's danger, according to the report of Wilson, Kilgore, and Sheen. These preachers endangered their members by holding church services and defy government measures to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Unfortunately, these preachers failed to recognize the temptation of power and the danger it holds for our faith. Secondly, this kind of eschatology failed to address the unjust social structure. This is evident from the fact that dispensational theology failed to explain and challenge the evil, which arises from the unjust social structures within human society, rather than individual weaknesses. These preachers more often to blame if an individual is poor, underprivileged, and marginalized. For example, during the outbreak of COVID-19, these preachers view the global pandemic as the result of individual fault. As Professor Koster mentioned that especially the American evangelical groups, including majority of the Pentecostal preachers, regardless of their race, social class, and gender and disability. Despite study shows that the poor, colored people, and workforce are the most vulnerable and victims of pandemic, yet these doomsday preachers always trivialized the reality of individual sin and evil, but failed to recognize the sin and evil were active in institutions and structures of the contemporary society. Third, this eschatological model does not promote solidarity with nature. Rather, it tolerates the notion of ecological distraction. In 2015, one case study shows that the Christian groups are the least engaged with climate change issues compared with Buddhists in the US and Australia based on the study of Morrison, Duncan, and Parton. The study shows that one of the skeptical groups, aside from that, about climate change issues mostly consists of conservative Christian groups. However, the most conservative Christian group were convinced that the climate change is real. They viewed climate change or global warming is part of God's plan. Although he is not a dispensationalist theologian, a popular American pastor and prolific author, John MacArthur, publicly stated recently, God intended it is a disposable planet. Consequently, like MacArthur and many conservative Christian groups become complacent on the ecological justice. Many Pentecostal groups, dispensationalists in particular, prepare to join the climate change skeptical group. For them, either climate change is accurate or false, there's no pressing needs to respond to it in light of the impending peril the predestined for the earth and her ungodly inhabitants. Quoted. Such religious ideology, scholars contend, normalize ecological exploitation and destruction. It divorces the human beings from nature. More importantly, it serves the main agenda of global capitalism that maintain the lucrative flow of goods and resources. Lastly, this version of eschatological uh, model become a single encompassing framework that produce a triumphalistic attitude within many Christian conservative groups. In numerous cases, religion has been instrumentalized with a certain efficacy in providing legitimation of colonizers over colonized indigenous people. Today, religious argument, whether intentionally or not, played a large role in the public realm, including the political opinion or discourse or public policy, according to Bloom. Something very clear in the ideology of dispensationalism. Arvin Arderson and Grace Halsell exposes the hidden violence of dispensationalism, which increasingly manifests its violent character to military occupation of Palestinian territories, building of settlements in Palestinian territories, illegal detention of Palestinian minors, and Israel imposes apartheid regions. Basically, dispensational theologians justify and give some rational reasons for these crimes. For example, Anderson exposes the ideological element of dispensationalism. He argues that Christian Zionism and their eschatological views or end time beliefs are shaping the Western foreign policy in the Middle East. Using dispensationalism as a single encompassing eschatological model, they attempted to offer theological legitimation of white supremacy, racism, military occupation, and colonialism. It justified ethnic cleansing, apartheid state, Zionist colonialization project, illegal settlement and annexation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Despite overwhelming of evidence human rights violations, like many others Christian groups, dispensationalists consistently justify Israel's brutal military occupation of Palestinian territories. Now, taken as a whole, this kind of eschatological thought shows that concerted expressions of Western imperialist colonial ideology. Like other Western imperialist or colonialist ideologies, dispensationalism as religious ideology normalizes, empowers, and encourages the following: violence, dualistic worldview, authoritarian leadership, white supremacy, racism, ethnic cleansings, apartheid state, domination, exploitation, colonialism, imperialism, regardless whether done consciously or not. That said, it is important to challenge this popular eschatological thought. Therefore, the following pertinent questions are raised. Why decoloniality in relation to dispensation is important to address this hidden violence of this bad theology, and what ways the colonial option can help the Christian eschatology. So due to the limited space, I only focus on three things that has become evident in decoloniality, and also in this, if you use decoloniality, that will eventually shows very evident to dispensationalism. First, decoloniality has ability to name the naming the problem. Following Quijano-Mignolo notion of decoloniality, it identified dispensationalism as part of coloniality, or the Western colonial matrix of power. This religious ideology that dominates Christian eschatological thought has, for most of American Christian groups, no name. Naming and articulating Western colonial matrix of power in public conversation, it helps many Christian groups to understand and reclaim eschatology from the imperial ideological captivity. Ultimately, it is possible to contest and dismantle this imperial ideological captivity of Christian eschatology when they are exposed as a social construct by a particular group rather than the expressions of natural facts. Second, decoloniality as an epistemic disobedience or delinking from the Western canon of knowledge eventually creates a space that value non-Western worldview, chiefly the indigenous worldviews, quoting Walter Mignolo. Being sources of knowledge or epistemology, decoloniality is concerned how and where is knowledge produced, moving away from the polarities, for example, body, soul, religious, secular, communist, capitalism, traditional modernity. Decoloniality view reality as a whole, integral, intersectional. Hence, decoloniality sees intersections of knowledge production, religious worldview, human sexuality, ecological issues, and political economic problems. Now, decoloniality questions geopolitics of knowledge production, which has been internalized as universal, absolute truth, with important implication for pursuing epistemic justice. Epistemic justice exposes the misrepresentation of knowledge system or worldview. For example, Western scholars viewed indigenous worldviews as pagan, primitive, backward, and disposable, while Western knowledge as scientific, logical, rational, and universal. However, the colonial thinkers contend that indigenous worldview and epistemologies are holistic, integral, relational, complex, which affirms that human being is fundamentally part of ecological system. In short, decoloniality offers understanding of interrelation between self. Nature is basically an understanding of our own self. Lastly, decoloniality refuses the depoliticization and misframing of social concerns. Like other decolonial thinkers, Mignolo contend that decoloniality is both political and epistemic project. Critics argue that depoliticization of social concerns like, for example, COVID-19 is very problematic and worrisome today. For instance, many Western academic, theological, and religious discourses have no political and economic connections. They like to celebrate interfaith dialogue without tackling the socio-political context, the materiality of that issue. Consequently, Christian theology, religious study have no other social impact. For example, policy-making process, peace building, and political economic issues, including public health issues. That is, they have simply been omitted from the Western discourse within the colonial matrix of power. So global poverty, neoliberal ideology, white supremacy, etc., remain unquestioned until today. In conclusion, Christian eschatological thought is not exempted from the logic of Western imperial ideological captivity. As pointed out above, the Western colonial matrix of power is embedded in the popular Christian eschatological thought or dispensationalism. Due to some weaknesses of biblical, theological, and sociological imagination, most of Christian groups have been easily succumbed to literalist interpretation of eschatology. For example, during and after the outbreak of COVID-19, mass hysteria episode and apocalyptic anxiety manifested spread around the world. Instead of taking rational approach, it is easier to diss most people, especially conservative Christians, to imagine the end of the world. As Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson described, the basic thought is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Moreover, the mass hysteria and apocalyptic anxiety are being used as a weapon of the dispensationalist preachers that paralyze the people to engage the public issues. These preachers actually understand the power of emotion and apocalyptic imagination, while such conservative Christian groups are often portrayed as a marginal extremists. The eschatological thought they espouse have been influenced the mainstream Western politics, for example, the geopolitics in the Middle East, far more than critics realize. That said, decolonizing eschatology is a crucial task. What we need now, a new framework that is independent to the Western colonial matrix of power, especially in the response of post-COVID era. This process is complementary epistemic reconstitution requires Christian citizens to develop an attitude of acceptance toward religious pluralism. Epistemic justice requires conservative Christian groups to engage their attitude to other religious groups, thus decolonizing the Christian eschatological thought. In the process, it become more attentive, sensitive, and responsive to the global socio-economic political crisis, more importantly, providing a path to reconstruct a post-COVID-19 society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Haji, and thank you, Beverly and Volker, for your presentations. We have some questions from the audience. I think it would be, we'll start with their questions so that you can hear what's going on in people's mind as you have been presenting. And I've asked Michael if he can share those questions with you, and then we'll continue the conversation from there. It's obvious that not to make light of COVID, it's obvious that there are other pandemics. HIV/AIDS, for example, it's ongoing. Poverty is ongoing. There are other struggles, and maybe Christian theology is part of that pandemic that's a big problem for us. So I'll pass it on to Michael. Can you please turn on your camera?
Okay, I cannot, so that's all right. I can speak, but I can't turn on my camera because. Okay, now I can turn on my camera, and there are lots of buttons to click here, but I managed to get it. So some of the questions are directed to colleagues. Well, thank you all, colleagues. Questions have been directed to colleagues that have tried to answer. I think that the questions would merit a larger awareness of it and conversation. So particular question being, if the virus is part of nature, how about the economic Tower of Babel of globalization and one belt, one road that empires try to dominate the world through their hegemonic power, which then carry the virus to the world? Does punishment theory has anything to do with this? So that's a question being posed there. So I can note that as a question. And someone picked up the expression, I mean, God's suffering with the suffering creation. Isn't this a statement which we quote to justify the after effects of human failure to live in harmony with the creation by theologizing each and every crisis we confront? So it's a question about whether this is a kind of the kind of default liturgical chant we have without getting to some of the systemic failures. So that is something that any one of the colleagues can pick up on. And I think that I've seen a question come in, especially for Beverly here. I want to see if it's a question, maybe Beverly has seen, and I'll read the comment, blah, blah, blah. Even now, HIV is viewed as a punishment for sexual immorality. Therefore, it is the result of sin. But COVID-19 now moved from the concept of sin to the concept of global phenomenon because it is common and normal to all. In this context, can you suggest to us as an ecclesia, how can we explore new ways to include the people who are vulnerable and marginalized? So there's an element about, okay, we have heard this, but how about making the connection and what new ways can be suggested? So those are the three: God's suffering with suffering creation. We understand it. Is this a cop-out? Is this not dealing with systemic issues? And then the larger one, does punishment theory has anything to do with the fact that we are taking the virus with us?
So who wants to go first? Volker or Beverly? Beverly, please.
I can go first. I'll start off with a question that was directed directly to me. I think, in fact, some of the points of connection through all of our three presentations was exactly addressing this question, which is precisely how, in a global phenomenon such as ours, and the HIV pandemic was actually a global phenomenon. It was more hidden from perhaps the wealthier nations of the world. How do we be a new kind of church that actually addresses the vulnerable and not the powerful? And I think part of what I was trying to say, and I think the other two papers in different ways said similar things, was that we needed to actually address systemic injustice, that we needed to look and almost dig into every aspect of the pandemic to say, how is this pandemic? And I think COVID is a good example of that, precisely because it is so visibly a global phenomenon. And yet there are layers upon layers. In the webinar yesterday, one of the speakers spoke about the layers and layers of death. And I think this is a lovely way of looking the way we need to draw in the vulnerable and the marginalized, and to recognize, yes, death, physical death, everyone in the community is vulnerable to that. But some are more vulnerable for a whole host of complex reasons, such as race and class. And I think part of the challenge is, how do we look and find those systemic failures that one of the other questions was addressing? And part of what I'm saying is we need to be astute in intersecting our theological reflection with social analyses. I think we also need to quite directly reject church theology, which refuses to understand how we take quite deliberately the epistemological option for the poor and stand with the poor and the marginalized. And I think if we are prepared to do that, then our theology becomes much more prophetic and liberatory, and inherently sides with those who are vulnerable. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Beverly. Volker, and also for the sake of the audience, we have Datyong Benny Liu as well as Gerald West and Kuzipa in the room. They can also make comments or raise questions. So Volker first.
Well, obviously, I'm struggling with the punishment metaphor, and I was very much opposed of using that in the context of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, because I had the impression that it was a clear moralist agenda behind it. What I see now is that somehow we are losing again the language power of our own metaphors. They are going secular. And I feel we don't have too much to say about it theologically. Yeah? So I think I would like, in this context, use the punishment metaphor as a metaphorical hermeneutical tool to tackle this whole issue of global risk society. I mean, that would be my way to go at the moment, probably. The second question about God is suffering with the creation, you may have realized that I'm more in line with Johann Baptist Metz than with Jürgen Moltmann, because in Metz theology, I have the impression he plays back the ball to God. You know, I mean, you can be angry with God and you can struggle with God. And I think that makes things much more ambiguous and complicated than just saying God is suffering with creation.
Thank you. I want to get as many questions on the table. So we'll go to Benny. Michael have other questions from the audience, but Benny, please.
I want to ask a question about stigmatization. So I think Beth was really helpful to point out how AIDS has been stigmatized in terms of individual morality. But as Volker pointed out in his paper, the whole thing about China virus. So the movie actually also, curiously enough, the movie Contagion also has the virus starting in Asia with Asian people, right?
Yeah.
So I'm suggesting that actually COVID also has a form of stigmatization, but it is on a people and a country, especially China. And China has long been an easy target for the power in the geopolitical West. So I want to link that with Haji's concern about decoloniality has to do with properly identifying Western empire. So how do we deal with this kind of stigmatization of a people and a country? Not individual morality, but a whole country and a whole people, especially people of Chinese ancestry in the country of China.
Thank you, Benny. That came up in our panel yesterday with Wei's presentation and this anti-Chinese energy that's coming out, well, strongly from the US. Well, let's name that. Do anyone on the panel want to address this stigmatization element? Kuzipa first.
Not the stigmatization element. I had a different
Okay.
intervention.
Okay, let's see stigmatization. Or Beverly, you have to unmute, Beverly.
Yeah, I think it was one of the points where I would stand a little differently from where Volker placed himself in the whole stigma debate. And I think it demonstrates different contexts. I really don't think we can discount stigma. And Benny has just helpfully pointed out how stigma doesn't just operate at a local and national level, but also operates globally, and particularly when powerful political figures like Trump exacerbate the problem. And it seems to me, because stigma was so deadly in the HIV pandemic, that it is something that has to be clearly placed on the theological agenda for those of us trying to understand. I think it's much more complex than HIV, precisely for this reason that not just individuals or communities or particular groups of people, but whole nations become stigmatized. And so I think we need to begin to explore how stigma is operating within our communities, within our diversity of communities in each of our contexts, and to try and understand what is actually going on. Because I think even in our context, where religion is used, still, even in the COVID context, as a stigmatizing force. I think we've got to be more nuanced about the way we speak about stigma. So thank you, Benny, for adding another layer to the whole debate.
Okay, thank you, Beverly. Volker, and then we'll take a different question from Kuzipa, please.
Well, due to time, I didn't realize, I didn't mention one scene in the film where one of the doctors who was sent by the WHO to China and is kidnapped. And then she is released in exchange to the vaccine. And then the guy from her boss from the WHO tells her, that they actually gave placebos, and then she walks away and solidarizes with a Chinese village. Yeah? So there is a moment that clearly makes a point that there's a difference between people and states. And of course, I mean, we heard that in the US, Asians were spit at and even more harassed because of this polemic and stigmatization by Trump. But I think the very difficult issue at stake here is that China is also playing a power game. As we all know, they forced the WHO to keep quiet for some time. And we lost 2 weeks or so in fighting the pandemic. So whether we like it or not, there are empires in the world, and it's not only the US, but it's also China. And I think we have to find a way to also speak prophetically against these empires without discriminating against the people who live in the empire and who may very often not feel happy with being part of that empire.
Okay, thank you.
Can I say something about that?
Okay, Haji, yes.
Yeah, I think in the context, I mean, I'm going to say something about my personal experience, because I've been here in Europe for almost 4 years and a half. This phenomenon it's not new. Stigmatize to stigmatize people of color is not new in Europe. I would say that racism and white supremacy, this is the root that until now unquestioned, and not properly addressed, is even in the Christian community here. That's why we have this program now with the Presbyterian churches or mainline Protestant churches to put this on the table, to challenge this. Although the institution are not willing, really, they publish manuscript about this theologically, but in the grassroots level, I don't think so. It is addressed properly.
Racism, white supremacism. Kuzipa, well, sorry, I'm just trying to move to get as many questions and voices.
Okay.
Kuzipa?
I refer to the first presentation by Bev and the last one by Haj. I'm interested how you would, if at all, include the category of sin as such in your reflections. And I refer particularly to the reference to narrow notions of personal morals, and also in the last presentation talking about the eschatological focus by the Pentecostal spiritualities, which may seem spiritualized, but also quite earthed and embodied in their preaching of the prosperity and wealth and health gospels, which seem to have a bodily focus, but at the same time, they it's as if to say, the vulnerability of those who suffer is not a concern, but my prosperity is a concern. So just in that area.
Thank you. If it's not punishment, then what does sin mean? Walker?
Well, I mean, I think I learned my lesson here from liberation theology, that we have to take structural sin into consideration, which also liberation theologians would always say that does not mean that personal sin does not exist. Yeah? But I would go into that direction to say we have to look at globalization in terms of structural sin.
Thank you. Michael, are there other questions? I mean,
Yeah. So there are a couple here I would read, but there are two comments in terms of following the conversation. I think it comes up, the idea of the new and what new language we could find and new ways of articulating within this context that is before us. There's also something that we need to be mindful of, especially in a film like Volker highlighted, which is in terms of the kind of white savior complex of the person going in, saving, even though you can't misjudge the woman's commitment to the Chinese folk. So that's the bit that we need to wrestle with. And then with the artwork, the second artwork that Bev highlighted, it's interesting. It's done in a European context, and the people who are taking Jesus off the cross are all medics. But the reality here, especially in the UK, Netherlands, and different places around, most of the people in the front line of the medical services come from what we would call ethnic minority perspective. And so the representation seems to me to be still Eurocentric in who are the people taking down Jesus from the cross. And I think it's also interesting from this perspective, when I look at the thread here, that both Haji and Volker, in doing the discourse, and especially Haji, I would have, we could have asked in terms of located in the Netherlands, if, for instance, the Pentecostal tradition undermines the public safety, how much of liberal theology can also undermine the safety of minorities? How do you juxtapose the two in terms of minority lives here? But there is also one specific question here that comes, and I think this person is located in the Netherlands. Is there something that can be said theologically about our responsibility for the environment, especially considering the fact that more and more wildlife, such as bats, etc., are becoming part of a spreading of epidemics and pandemics, not only COVID-19, but Ebola noted. And I suspect this would be something that, from a South African context, one may wish to reflect on further, because I think there is certainly perceptions there. Can we refer to people of color as colored? Is God with the marginalized? If so, why are the rich not supporting the poor? That is, the young who cannot study online. So it's a combination of questions, colleague, but I just throw it out there. So I made some observation, and then I have those questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the people who have raised the questions. There are so many questions here. Yeah. Where do we start? I would like to make a distinction on this issue on white savior ideology. There are two issues for me there. This salvific orientation and the white element of that salvific orientation. So, shall we ask the white man to answer that?
Well, I knew that it would go into my direction sooner or later. Well, I mean, the film, of course, let me start with the film. The film, of course, has its limit. I was struggling very much with the end, because I was thinking, well, now we are talking about the US and that they have a lottery to distribute the vaccine and so on, and what is happening to the rest of the world. But then I thought, well, but it points back into the film that this woman is siding with these people from that Chinese village. And then now, since we are now in this black and white thing, at least I have to say Chiba is black. Yeah. So the guy who's running the whole thing in the film, yeah. If we play the color game, we have to see the hero in this case is not the white savior, but the black savior. But I mean, basically, I'm interested in this whole issue of language and new language. I think we have to reclaim our own theological language. So the question on this whole issue of sin, and also the question I raised about punishment, means how can we find an adequate theological language to respond in this situation and give our contribution. Yeah. And what makes me curious is that at the moment you see this language in the secular context, whether it's reconciliation in the whole debate in South Africa, which became a political term, of course, and then was a bit reclaimed because Tutu was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we see it now in the debate on COVID-19, where the ecologist takes a punishment metaphor. And obviously, as theologians, we don't have to say anything about that.
Thank you, Volker. Beverly?
I wanted to respond to an earlier comment around this by Volker, in that I think one of the key things in the HIV epidemic here was that we did have a language for the whole punishment issue, and that was the notion of retribution theology. And I think if all of us listening are on this webinar really think about it, inherent in the kind of theology traditional theology we've grown up with, there are elements of this kind of retribution, and even within secular society, that when things go wrong for people, particularly illness, the first question we often ask ourselves is, what did we do wrong? What's happened here? So we might not necessarily go to the point of saying, why is God punishing me? Although it often does lead down that road. And I think retribution is the antithesis of liberation and life. And I think that's the kind of theological language that we should be pushing our discussion into. I think in terms of the whole sort of white savior kind of complex, I think that's what I was trying to say in terms of understanding stigma, but I think also in understanding the systemic systems and the layers of death and vulnerability. That for all of us, there's a sense within which we, in the South African context, we're constantly having to unpack the race issues. In the HIV context, it was often white communities that could offer something to HIV orphans, for instance. And so it perpetuated the sense of the savior complex. And I think one of the real key lessons in the HIV epidemic, which we still have to learn how we deal with in the COVID epidemic, is that we need to mobilize communities. We need to mobilize communities, peer educators, communities to take responsibility for their health, for their well-being, for educating others about what this, and I think COVID does that. I mean, in South Africa at the moment, we've moved into now what is known as level 1, and the government has appealed to us that it's now individual citizens' responsibility to ensure that the virus isn't spread. And that means wear your mask, sanitize, socially distance. And people are ignoring it. And where's the accountability? And I think as churches, we have an important role to play, that every community needs to take responsibility for their community and mobilize. Thanks.
Thank you, Beverly. Time is escaping us, which is a weird thing for me as a Pacific Islander to say. But we'll give a chance to Gerald. He has not said, he's been very quiet. And then we'll go to Michael to begin to bring us to the end of this webinar. Gerald first and then Michael.
Sione, thank you. Two related observations in listening to these papers. Thank you so much for what you've shared. The one is how where we are with the virus is not in the same place in our different contexts. You know, what is elusive about COVID is that it's not static. It keeps moving, and we are in different places in terms of the movement around the world. And I think that's significant for, if theology is about process rather than about content, how do we do theology with a moving virus? I think that's the question. Related to that is the kinds of resources we use. It seems to me each of you have been grappling with notions of intersection. What intersects with what? How does COVID intersect with different aspects of our reality? And I wanted just to put something there that relates to Haj's paper there, very provocatively. What we found helpful in the context of HIV around notions of retribution is that it was a concept that made sense in indigenous culture as well as in Christian theology. So within African traditional indigenous cultures, there are notions of what we might call retribution. Each language has its own way of explaining that, whether it's a disciplining by the ancestors or balancing of the ancestors or whatever language is used. And that is very helpful, I think, that we need to look for theological categories that decolonize Hajj. I think that's key for us. And that means that they have to engage with the indigenous and not just with the colonial. They've got to deal with the post-colonial and the decolonial. So I think that's a very, how do we find theological concepts and categories that resonate across the intersections of our realities?
Thank you very much, Gerald. I love that. How do we do theology with a moving virus? The whole idea is that we are people of a movement, and we get stuck in becoming this kind of big organization rather than developing flexibility, be always moving and so on. But I'd like to thank you, colleagues, very much. One of the tasks I've given myself, and I think Sione has also given himself, is that we are picking up the kind of key phrases and terms and metaphors that are coming up in terms of the new and the renewed and possibilities in the direction we're going to take us. So, I mean, in terms of Volker and yesterday, Dorothea, one can see connection to its larger paper than that with Juliana and so on, so their connection. And Haji, some of the papers that we have had passed and those that are coming, there are connections there. And Bev, especially with yours, I think with Anna from Jamaica, in terms of how churches and ecclesial communities then respond in terms of the theologies that we embodied, is an interesting kind of thing to interrogate and to see, what our response look like and how it falls short. But we'd like to thank you, colleagues, very much for your input. We'd like to thank the participants, those who have just followed and have shared their question and have listened well, for their contribution and for the thoughts they have expressed and for taking this on further in whatever direction they're heading. So we'd like to remind you that the Asia and Pacifica webinars will continue at the same time tomorrow, November the 1st, with presentations from Kuzipa, and Sitambiso would not be there, but we would have his presentation nevertheless, and Anthony Reddy. So please join us, and please also, if you're able, make yourself available to join the other webinars if time and the time zone would allow you. But in any case, it would be available, and it is available on Facebook. As is now our tradition, as part of this conversation, we're going to have what we call a poetic benediction. And unfortunately, Mariana can't be with us. And here again, in terms of what Julie has highlighted in terms of a digital divide, that's the reality with us. But instead, we have our own other poet in residence, Sione, who would bless us with a benediction, a poetic benediction.
Out of touch, out of touch. Do not touch, for on that day you will surely die. The fruit hanging from the centered tree will give you knowledge, but God forbids. Do not touch, or you will pay the consequences of knowledge. Knowledge is power, power is dangerous, and danger, don't touch. Fast forward. Do not touch, or you might contract those other pandemics, which many straight folks spread. Do not touch reality, but look up to the illusions with which Christian thieves steal land, wealth, bodies, faith, and imagination. Do not touch, or you will face punishment and isolation. Slowly, go back to the garden, that place, that story, thought to be the genesis of punishment. Go back and remember, yep, they were not alone. They had company. who helped them see things. They talked, she listened, she learned and was delighted with possibilities and alternatives. She picked the fruit, she touched, and she ate, and her eyes were open. She saw the pleasures of knowledge. She shared, and he too took according to his own will. He too ate, but he did not learn enough yet, still. They touched, ate, and learned that they were naked, exposed, vulnerable, limited, disposable. In touching, they irritated and made the god mad. Kick them out was the god solution. Install the cherubim, flesh the flaming sword, lock the garden, guard the other fruit, so that no mortal may live forever. That other fruit that gives life eternal, keep that one out of touch. Should I say amen to that?
Amen.
Living is limited. No mortal lives forever. But life is generational. Life passes from one generation to the next. Living will end, but life passes through. Diseases will infect, pain, and stop the living, but life is not out of touch. And life should not be out of touch for generations to come. Life should not be out of touch for all creatures and plants, in the sea, under the ground, above the skies, and on earth. Life should not be out of touch. To that, I say, Amen.